This is my true story. I went to visit my rich son after 20 years of silence, wearing my cleanest shirt and carrying a small box of sweets for the grandchildren I had never met. I took a 12-hour bus ride to his mansion, rehearsing what I would say when I finally saw him again, imagining how he would hug me and welcome me into his beautiful home. But when he opened the door and saw me standing there, his face filled with disgust, and he immediately called the police. Within minutes, I was in handcuffs being arrested. But you won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. 20 years ago, I made the hardest decision of my entire life, a decision that would cost me everything I owned and change the trajectory of both our futures in ways I couldn't fully understand at the time. My son had just graduated from high school with excellent grades, top of his class, full of potential and dreams of going to a prestigious university that would give him opportunities I never had growing up in poverty. But we had no money for college, barely had enough money to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads, and the scholarships he applied for weren't enough to cover the full cost of tuition and living expenses at the school that had accepted him. I owned a small house. Nothing fancy, but it was paid off and it was ours, the only real asset I had accumulated after decades of working manual labor jobs that destroyed my body but kept us fed. I made the decision to sell that house, to take the equity I had built up over 20 years of mortgage payments and use every single penny to pay for my son's first year of college tuition. I thought maybe he could get loans for the remaining years, maybe find part-time work, maybe figure something out. But I wanted to give him that first year without the burden of debt hanging over his head from day one. After selling the house, we moved into a tiny apartment, just one bedroom that I let my son have while I slept on the couch in the living room for the few months before he left for university. I worked 3 jobs to cover our rent and living expenses and to save whatever I could to help him with books and supplies and the little extras that college students need. I worked construction during the day, cleaned office buildings at night, and did weekend shifts at a warehouse loading trucks, and my body started breaking down from the constant physical labor and the lack of sleep and the stress of trying to provide for my son's education. I went hungry more times than I could count during those months, skipping meals so my son could eat properly before he left for college, telling him I had already eaten or wasn't hungry, when the truth was I couldn't afford to feed both of us. I lost weight, my clothes hung loose on my frame, my hands shook from exhaustion and malnutrition. But I kept working and kept sacrificing because I believed this was what fathers did for their children. I wanted him to focus on his studies without worrying about me, wanted him to have the college experience he deserved, wanted him to escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped me my entire life. The day he left for university, I stood in that apartment and watched him pack his things into the old car I had somehow managed to buy for him, and I cried tears of pride and hope and love as I thought about the bright future he was going to have. I had given up my house, my health, my comfort, my security, all of it sacrificed so my son could have a chance at something better. He hugged me goodbye and promised to call every week, promised to write letters, promised he would make me proud, and I believed him because I had no reason not to trust the boy I had raised and loved and given everything to. I thought about how one day he would graduate and get a good job and maybe help me out a little bit, maybe invite me to visit wherever he ended up living, maybe introduce me to his future wife and children, and let me be part of his successful life. I wasn't expecting him to support me or owe me anything. I just wanted to be part of his world, wanted to see the results of my sacrifice, wanted to know that everything I had given up had been worth it because he was happy and successful. I had no way of knowing that the day I watched him drive away to college would be the last time my son would treat me like I mattered, the last time he would hug me, the last time he would look at me with anything other than shame and disgust. After my son left for university, the phone calls came regularly for the first few months, every week like he had promised, and we would talk about his classes and his new friends and how different college life was from our small town. But gradually the calls became less frequent, every 2 weeks instead of every week, then once a month, then only on major holidays, and eventually they stopped completely and I found myself waiting by the phone on Sundays, hoping to hear his voice, but hearing only silence. The letters he had promised to write came a few times at the beginning, short notes telling me he was busy with studies and doing well. But those stopped too after the first semester, and I stopped getting any communication from him at all. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Tried writing letters to his dorm address, but they came back marked, "Return to sender." Tried reaching out through the university, but they said they couldn't give out student information to people who claimed to be family without verification. I felt him slipping away from me month by month, year by year, until it became clear that my son had deliberately cut me out of his life without explanation or warning or any acknowledgement of what I had sacrificed to give him his education. I told myself he was just busy, just focused on building his future, just going through a phase that would end once he graduated and settled into adult life. After he graduated, I heard nothing directly from him, but occasional news filtered back to me through distant relatives and old neighbors who somehow kept track of his success through social media and professional networks that I didn't understand or have access to. They told me he had gotten a job at a major tech company, that he was making excellent money, that he had gotten married to a beautiful woman from a wealthy family, that he was climbing the corporate ladder faster than anyone expected. I was proud, even though the pride was mixed with hurt. Proud that my sacrifice had worked, even though I was no longer part of the life I had made possible. Years passed, and the news that reached me became more impressive and more painful at the same time. I heard he had started his own company, that he had become a millionaire before he turned 30, that he lived in a mansion in an exclusive neighborhood with gates and security guards. I heard he had children, my grandchildren, kids I had never met and apparently never would meet based on his complete silence toward me. Every piece of news was a knife in my heart, confirmation that he was living the dream I had given him while I struggled to survive on disability payments after my body finally gave out from decades of manual labor. I lived in a tiny one-room apartment, the cheapest place I could find, surviving on government assistance and the occasional odd job I could still manage despite my failing health. My hands were permanently damaged from years of construction work. My back was destroyed from lifting and carrying. My knees barely worked anymore. All the physical consequences of working 3 jobs to pay for my son's education while he was becoming wealthy and successful and apparently ashamed of where he came from. I kept a photo of him on my wall, the last picture I had from before he left for college, and I would look at it sometimes and wonder what I had done wrong to make him cut me out of his life so completely. 20 years passed this way. 20 years of silence and abandonment, and wondering if my son even remembered I existed or if he had erased me from his memory the same way he had erased me from his life. I heard through relatives that he never mentioned having a father, that he told people he came from nothing and built himself up through his own hard work, that he had rewritten his history to exclude the man who had given up everything so he could have his chance. But I still loved him, despite the abandonment, still thought about him every day. Still hoped that somehow he would remember me and reach out, and that foolish hope eventually led me to make the decision to go visit him after 2 decades of being forgotten. After 20 years of silence and hurt and waiting for a phone call that never came, I finally gathered my courage and decided I would go visit my son even though he had made it clear through his absence that he didn't want me in his life. I told myself that maybe he was just busy, maybe he didn't realize how much time had passed. Maybe seeing me in person would remind him of the bond we used to have, and he would welcome me back into his world. I spent weeks preparing for the trip, saving every penny I could from my small disability checks, planning what I would say when I finally saw him again after all these years. I bought a bus ticket to the city where he lived, a 12-hour journey that would take me across state lines to a place I had never been before. A wealthy area that felt like another world compared to the struggling neighborhood where I barely survived. I couldn't afford the train or a plane ticket, so the bus was my only option, and I sat in that uncomfortable seat for 12 hours straight with my small bag of belongings and my hopes rising with every mile that brought me closer to my son. I rehearsed conversations in my head, imagined him opening the door and his face lighting up with recognition and joy. Imagined him hugging me and apologizing for the years of silence and inviting me inside to meet his family. I wore my cleanest shirt, the one I saved for special occasions like court dates and job interviews. And I made sure I was as presentable as possible, even though all my clothes were old and worn, and clearly marked me as someone from a different economic class than the neighborhood I was heading to. I bought a small box of expensive chocolates from the nicest store I could find, spending money I really couldn't afford to spend because I wanted to bring a gift for the grandchildren I had never met. The box had pretty wrapping and a ribbon, and I held it carefully during the entire bus ride, making sure it didn't get crushed or damaged because I wanted everything to be perfect when I finally saw my son again. I arrived in his city in the early afternoon, took another bus to his neighborhood because I couldn't afford a taxi, and walked the final mile to his address carrying my small bag and my box of chocolates while trying not to be too obvious about how much the walk hurt my damaged knees and back. The neighborhood was beautiful in a way I had never experienced. Huge houses with manicured lawns and expensive cars in every driveway. The kind of place where someone like me clearly didn't belong. I found his address written on a piece of paper I had gotten from a relative, stood outside the gates of his mansion for several minutes, gathering my courage and wiping sweat from my face and trying to calm my racing heart. The house was enormous, bigger than any building I had ever been inside except maybe shopping malls, with tall iron gates and security cameras and everything that said wealthy, successful people live here. I pressed the button on the intercom system, announced myself as his father, heard a long silence followed by a buzzing sound as the gates slowly opened. I walked up the long driveway with my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack before I reached the front door. My hands shaking as I clutched the box of chocolates, my eyes filling with tears as I imagined the reunion I had dreamed about for 20 years. The front door opened and my son stood there in the doorway, and for one brief moment I thought I saw recognition in his eyes. Thought maybe everything would be okay. Thought the years of silence would melt away and we would be father and son again. He was wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, a gold watch on his wrist that could have paid my rent for a year, standing in the doorway of his mansion, looking successful and handsome and nothing like the boy I remembered. I smiled through my tears and said his name, said, "It's me, it's your father, I came to see you," and I watched his expression change from surprise to something cold and hard that I didn't recognize. He stood there in that doorway, looking at me like I was something disgusting he had found on the bottom of his expensive shoe, his face transforming from the brief flash of recognition into an expression of pure contempt that cut through me worse than any physical pain I had ever endured. For one heartbeat, maybe two, I saw the little boy who used to hold my hand when we walked to the park, the child who called me daddy and hugged me goodnight, the son who cried when I had to work late and couldn't read him bedtime stories. But that glimpse of the boy I remembered disappeared so quickly I wondered if I had imagined it, replaced by the face of a stranger who looked at me with disgust and something close to hatred. I stood there on his doorstep, holding the box of chocolates that suddenly felt foolish and inadequate, my cleanest shirt that suddenly felt dirty and shabby in comparison to his tailored suit, my whole body trembling with emotion and exhaustion from the 12-hour bus ride and the long walk to his house. I whispered his name again, said, "It's me, it's your father. I came to visit you after all these years," my voice breaking with tears I couldn't control. I wanted him to smile, wanted him to step forward and embrace me, wanted him to invite me inside and introduce me to his wife and children, wanted some acknowledgement that I was his father, and that meant something despite the 20 years of silence. Instead, his face went even colder, his mouth twisting into something that might have been a snarl, his eyes scanning me from head to toe in a way that made me feel like I was being evaluated and found completely worthless. He didn't move toward me, didn't reach out to shake my hand or accept the chocolates I was holding out to him, just stood there in his expensive clothes, looking at me like I was a homeless person who had wandered onto his property by mistake. I saw him glance past me toward the street, saw him check if any of his neighbors were watching this interaction, saw the shame and embarrassment cross his face at being seen with someone who looked like I did. I tried to speak again, tried to explain that I had saved money for months to take this trip, that I had thought about him every day for 20 years, that I just wanted to see him and meet his family and know that he was happy. But the words caught in my throat as I watched him take a step backward into his house. watched him reach for his phone with hands that moved quickly like he was dealing with an emergency, watched him turn away from me without saying a single word in response to my presence. His silence was more painful than any insult could have been, more devastating than if he had screamed at me or told me to leave, because it communicated clearly that I wasn't even worth speaking to. He pulled out his phone and started typing or dialing, his back turned to me while I stood there confused and hurt and trying to understand what was happening. I thought maybe he was calling his wife to tell her I was here, maybe arranging for me to stay for dinner, maybe doing something normal that would explain this strange, cold reception. I stood there holding my box of chocolates like an idiot, my heart breaking a little more with each second that passed in silence, my mind refusing to accept what was becoming increasingly obvious. This was not the reunion I had imagined during 12 hours on a bus. This was not the son I remembered. This was a stranger who happened to share my blood and apparently wished he didn't. Then I heard him speaking into his phone in a low voice I had to strain to hear, and the words I caught made my blood turn to ice in my veins. He was talking to someone about an intruder on his property, about someone who wouldn't leave, about needing help immediately, and I realized with dawning horror that he was calling the police on his own father who had traveled 12 hours just to see him. He stood there with his back still turned to me, speaking into his phone in that low, urgent voice people use when they're reporting an emergency. And I heard him say there was someone trespassing on his property who refused to leave despite being asked multiple times. I hadn't been asked to leave even once, hadn't been spoken to at all since I arrived, but he was already constructing a lie that would justify whatever he was planning to do to me. I stood frozen on his doorstep, unable to process what was happening, my mind rejecting the reality that my own son was calling someone to remove me from his property like I was a dangerous criminal instead of the father who had sacrificed everything for him. Within minutes, I heard sirens in the distance getting louder as they approached his neighborhood, and I saw him gesture to someone inside the house, saw a security guard in a uniform appear beside him, saw my son pointing at me while speaking to this stranger about the situation. The security guard approached me with his hand on his radio, asked me in a firm voice to step away from the door and wait by the gates, and I complied automatically because I was too shocked and confused to do anything else. I walked backward down the driveway, still clutching my box of chocolates, still trying to make eye contact with my son who refused to look at me, still hoping this was some terrible misunderstanding that would be cleared up any moment. 2 police cars pulled up to the gates with their lights flashing. No sirens now, but the silent flashing lights that drew attention from every house on the street. And I felt the shame burning my face as I realized neighbors were probably watching this scene unfold. 4 police officers got out of their vehicles and approached me with that professional wariness they use when dealing with potential threats, their hands near their weapons, their eyes assessing me as dangerous until proven otherwise. I tried to explain that I was just here to visit my son, that there had been some kind of mistake, that I wasn't trespassing or threatening anyone, but my words came out confused and desperate and probably made me sound exactly like the kind of person who needed to be removed. My son walked down the driveway to speak with the police officers, his face composed and calm like he was reporting a routine problem, and I heard him tell them that I had shown up uninvited to his home, that he had warned me repeatedly never to come here, that I had been harassing him for months, and this was the final straw. Every word was a lie, complete fabrication, because he hadn't communicated with me in 20 years and certainly hadn't warned me about anything. But he spoke with such confidence and authority, dressed in his expensive suit and standing in front of his mansion, that the police officers believed him automatically, because people like him don't lie to police while people like me do. I tried to contradict his story, tried to tell the officers the truth about being his father and just wanting to visit after 20 years, but they cut me off and told me to be quiet while they sorted this out. One officer asked my son if he wanted to press charges for trespassing and harassment, and I watched in disbelief as my son nodded and said yes. He wanted this person removed and charged and kept away from his property permanently. The officer turned to me and asked for identification, ran my name through their system, found nothing because I had never been in trouble with the law in my entire life. But that didn't matter because my son's word carried more weight than mine ever could. They told me I was being arrested for criminal trespassing, that I had the right to remain silent, all the words I had only heard on television before this moment. I felt handcuffs close around my wrists behind my back, felt the metal cold and tight against my skin, felt the box of chocolates slip from my hands and fall to the ground where it split open and spilled expensive candy across the pristine driveway of my son's mansion. As the police officers secured the handcuffs and prepared to walk me to their patrol car, as neighbors gathered on their lawns to watch this spectacle of a poor old man being arrested in their wealthy neighborhood, my son finally spoke directly to me for the first time since I had arrived at his house. His voice was cold and clear, loud enough that everyone could hear him, designed to humiliate me in front of the police and the neighbors and anyone else who was watching this scene unfold. He looked at me with his face twisted in disgust and said words that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life, words that destroyed whatever remained of my heart after 20 years of abandonment and silence. He told me I disgusted him, said those exact words without any emotion or hesitation, said that my poverty and my failures and my pathetic life were things he had worked his entire adult life to escape and erase. He said he didn't want his children anywhere near me, didn't want them to see what he came from, didn't want them to know that their successful father had crawled out of the gutter I still lived in. He said I reminded him of everything he hated about his past, that looking at me made him feel ashamed and embarrassed, that he had built his new life specifically to distance himself from people like me, and he wasn't going to let me ruin that by showing up and exposing his origins. I tried to speak, tried to tell him about the house I sold to pay his tuition, tried to remind him about the 3 jobs I worked until my body broke, just so he could eat in the campus cafeteria and focus on his studies. I wanted to tell him about the meals I skipped so he wouldn't go hungry, about the nights I slept on a couch so he could have a bedroom, about every single sacrifice I made because I loved him and wanted him to have opportunities I never had. But he cut me off before I could finish even one sentence, waved his hand dismissively like my words were annoying insects buzzing around his head, and told the police officers to remove me from his property immediately. He said if I ever came back, he would file for a restraining order, would press charges for stalking and harassment, would do whatever was necessary to keep me away from his family and his life. He said he had worked too hard to build his reputation and his success, to have it all destroyed by a poverty-stricken father who didn't understand that some bridges were meant to stay burned. He told me in front of everyone gathered there that I should be grateful he was only having me arrested instead of doing something worse, that I should take this as a warning to disappear back to whatever hole I had crawled out of and never contact him again for any reason. Then he turned his back on me one final time and started walking back toward his mansion, pausing only to speak briefly with his security guard about updating the access lists and making sure this situation never happened again. I called out to him one last time, said his name the way I used to say it when he was a child, tried to reach him through the walls he had built around his heart, but he didn't turn around or acknowledge that he had heard me. He just kept walking until he disappeared inside his house and the door closed behind him with a sound that felt final and absolute. The door between us closing forever. The police officers walked me to their car with my hands cuffed behind my back, one of them placing his hand on my head to guide me into the back seat the way they do with criminals they've arrested. I sat there in handcuffs behind the metal barrier that separated the back seat from the front, watching my son's mansion disappear from view as we drove away. The box of chocolates I had brought for my grandchildren still spilled across his driveway like the ruins of all my hopes. I had traveled 12 hours to be arrested by my own son, rejected and humiliated and treated like garbage, and I still couldn't fully understand what I had done to deserve this cruelty from the child I had loved more than my own life. I spent 3 nights in a county jail cell, locked up like a common criminal for the crime of visiting my own son and trying to be part of his life after 20 years of silence and abandonment. They processed me like any other arrestee, took my fingerprints and my photograph, made me change into an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on my thin frame, and led me to a cell that I would share with 3 other men who had actually committed real crimes. The mattress was thin and uncomfortable. The toilet was in the open without any privacy. The food was barely edible, and every minute I spent in that place felt like punishment for the sin of being poor and unwanted by my own flesh and blood. The other inmates asked me what I was in for, what crime I had committed to end up in jail, and I tried to explain that my son had called the police on me for trespassing on his property. but that it was all a misunderstanding. One of them laughed and said, "Nobody ends up in jail for a misunderstanding," said, "I must have done something to deserve being locked up, and I didn't have the energy to argue with him or explain the whole story." Another inmate asked if I had threatened my son or tried to hurt him, and I shook my head and said no, I just wanted to visit him. I just wanted to see my grandchildren. I just wanted to be acknowledged as his father after 2 decades of being erased from his life. They looked at me with something like pity after that. These men who had committed theft and assault. These criminals who had actually broken laws and hurt people, looking at me like I was the saddest person they had ever met. One of them said his own father had abandoned him when he was young, and he would give anything to have a dad who cared enough to visit. And the irony of a convicted criminal having more understanding and compassion than my successful son was not lost on me. I spent my nights lying on that thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, replaying every moment of that visit over and over in my mind and trying to understand where everything had gone so wrong. The box of chocolates I had brought sat in an evidence bag somewhere in the police station, crushed and ruined, just like my relationship with my son. Expensive candy I couldn't afford, spilled across his driveway like physical evidence of my foolishness. I thought about how I had saved money for months to buy that gift, how I had carefully chosen the nicest box I could find, how I had protected it during the entire 12-hour bus ride, only to have it end up as trash on his property. I thought about my grandchildren, who would never know their grandfather existed, who would grow up hearing stories about their father's success, without ever knowing about the man who made that success possible through sacrifice and love. On my 3rd day in jail, I was brought before a judge who looked at the charges and asked the prosecutor to explain why an elderly man with no criminal record was being held for trespassing on his own son's property. The prosecutor fumbled through the paperwork, admitted there was no prior restraining order or evidence of previous contact, acknowledged that this appeared to be a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. The judge looked at me with something like sympathy and said the charges were dismissed, that I was free to go, but that I should avoid contact with my son in the future to prevent any further legal complications. I was released with the clothes I had been arrested in, my small bag of belongings, and bus fare home that a social worker helped me obtain because I had spent all my money getting to my son's city and had nothing left for the return trip. I walked out of that jail into bright sunlight feeling older and more broken than when I had entered 3 days earlier. The humiliation of being arrested and jailed by my own son weighing heavier on me than any physical burden I had ever carried during my years of manual labor. My son built his empire on the ruins of my life, and he never looked back, never acknowledged what it cost me to give him his chance, never understood, or maybe never cared about the price I paid so he could escape poverty and become the successful, wealthy man he is today. He doesn't know that I lost my job at the construction company because I kept taking extra shifts and working when I was too exhausted to be safe, kept pushing my body beyond its limits to earn money for his books and supplies, and eventually made a mistake that got me fired and blacklisted from other construction work in our area. That job had been my main source of income, the stable employment that kept us fed and housed, and losing it meant I had to scramble for whatever work I could find to survive. He doesn't know that I lost our house not just because I sold it to pay his tuition, but because even after selling it, I went into debt trying to help him with expenses that kept coming up during his college years. I took out personal loans I couldn't afford to pay back, maxed out credit cards that charged interest I could never keep up with, borrowed money from anyone who would lend it to me, all so my son wouldn't have to worry about money while he focused on his studies and his future. By the time he graduated, I was drowning in debt with no way to climb out, living in the cheapest apartment I could find and working whatever jobs my destroyed body could still manage. He doesn't know that the reason my hands shake and my back is permanently bent and my knees barely work anymore is because of those 3 jobs I worked simultaneously for years, pushing my body past every reasonable limit because I believed that sacrificing my health was worth it if it meant my son could have a better life. The construction work destroyed my joints and my spine. The night cleaning shifts meant I never got proper sleep and my body never had time to heal. The warehouse work loading heavy boxes finished off what little physical capacity I had left. By the time I was 50 years old, my body was broken in ways that would never heal, disabled and unable to work, surviving on government assistance that barely covered rent and food. He doesn't know that I went hungry more times than I could count during his college years, that I lost dangerous amounts of weight because I was sending him every spare dollar for food and expenses, while I ate rice and beans when I ate at all. He doesn't know about the times I fainted from hunger at work, the times I stole food from construction sites because I hadn't eaten in days, the times I sat alone in my apartment with my stomach cramping and my head spinning while I looked at photos of my son and told myself this sacrifice was worth it. He was eating well in the campus cafeteria, studying in the library, making friends and having the college experience he deserved while I was destroying myself to make that possible. He doesn't know that I destroyed my entire future so he could have his, that I gave up any chance of retirement or comfort or security so he could graduate without debt and start his adult life with opportunities I never had. Every choice I made for years was about him, about giving him the best chance possible, about ensuring he wouldn't end up like me, trapped in poverty and manual labor with no way out. I succeeded in that goal. He became exactly what I hoped he would become. Successful and wealthy and free from the struggles that defined my entire existence. But I never imagined that his success would come with such complete rejection of the father who made it all possible. He tells people he came from nothing and built himself up through hard work, erasing me from his origin story like I never existed, like he pulled himself up by his own bootstraps without any help from anyone. He has rewritten his history to make himself the hero of a rags-to-riches story, where he is both the struggling beggar and the triumphant success, conveniently leaving out the father who actually lived in rags so his son could eventually wear riches. My son doesn't know the truth about what I sacrificed because he never asked and apparently never cared enough to wonder where the money came from or what it cost me to provide it. 3 weeks after I was arrested and released from jail, after I had returned to my tiny apartment and tried to piece together what remained of my shattered heart, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer because I assumed it was a bill collector or someone trying to sell me something I couldn't afford. But something made me pick up the phone and say hello to whoever was on the other end. A woman's voice came through, soft and hesitant, and she asked if I was my son's father, if I was the man who had been arrested at his house several weeks ago. I confirmed that I was, confused about who this was and why she was calling, and she took a deep breath before telling me she was my son's wife. She said her name and apologized immediately for calling without permission, said she had gotten my number from the police report that her husband had filed against me, and that she needed to talk to someone about what had happened because it was eating her alive with guilt and shame. She told me she had no idea I existed until the day the police arrested me. That in the 5 years she had been married to my son, he had never once mentioned having a father, had told her his parents were both dead, and he had grown up in foster care. She had believed this lie completely, had felt sorry for her husband's difficult childhood, had never suspected that somewhere out there was an elderly man who had sacrificed everything for the son who now pretended he didn't exist. She said she had been looking out the window when I arrived that day, had seen an old man in worn clothes carrying a small gift walking up their driveway, and had assumed I was someone soliciting donations or looking for work. She watched her husband open the door and then immediately call security and the police, watched me being arrested and handcuffed and taken away, and only after I was gone did she ask her husband who I was and what had just happened. That's when he finally told her the truth. Told her I was his biological father, told her I had shown up uninvited, and he had me removed because he didn't want his past contaminating his present. She said she asked him why he had lied about his parents being dead, why he had hidden the fact that he had a father who was apparently still alive and wanted to see him. He told her that I reminded him of poverty and struggle and the life he had fought so hard to escape, that he was ashamed of where he came from and ashamed of having a father who looked like I did and lived like I did. He said he had worked too hard building his reputation and his image to have it all undermined by an embarrassing poor father showing up at his mansion, that his colleagues and neighbors and friends all thought he was self-made, and he wanted to keep it that way. He told her that erasing me from his story was necessary for his success, that acknowledging me would make people respect him less, that I was a liability he couldn't afford to have in his life. She said she listened to all this and felt disgusted by the man she had married, felt ashamed that she had built her life with someone capable of such cruelty toward his own parent. She told me she had spent the weeks since my arrest looking up information about me, trying to understand who I was and what my relationship with my son had been before he erased me. She found old neighbors who remembered me, found records of the house I had sold, pieced together the story of how I had sacrificed everything to give my son his education and his opportunities. She said she cried when she realized what I had done for him and how he had repaid that sacrifice with abandonment and betrayal. She told me she was ashamed of her husband, ashamed to be married to someone who could treat his father this way, but that she was too afraid to leave because she had young children and no job and nowhere to go. She said she was trapped in a marriage with a man she no longer respected, and that even she, a woman who barely knew me, felt more pity and compassion for me than my own son had ever shown. She apologized for calling, apologized for not being able to help, apologized for being married to a man who could look at his sacrificing father with disgust and call the police instead of offering gratitude and love. I live alone now in a one-room apartment in a rough neighborhood in Texas, the cheapest place I could find that would accept someone with my limited income and poor credit history, surviving on disability checks from the government that barely cover rent and the most basic food and utilities. The apartment is small and dark, the walls are thin, and I can hear my neighbors fighting and crying and living their own difficult lives. The building smells like mold and old cooking oil, but it's all I can afford on $700 a month. I have no furniture except a mattress on the floor and a folding chair and a small table I found on the street. No television or computer or any of the things that make life comfortable, just the bare minimum needed to survive another day. My walls are covered with photographs of my son from when he was young, pictures from before he left for college, when he still smiled at me and hugged me and called me dad without shame or embarrassment. I have photos of him as a baby that I took with a disposable camera, photos of his first day of school, photos of his high school graduation where he stood proud in his cap and gown with his arm around my shoulders. These images cover every inch of wall space in my tiny apartment, surrounding me with memories of the boy who loved me before success taught him that loving me was something to be ashamed of. I look at these photos every day and try to remember what it felt like to be his father, when being his father meant something other than humiliation and rejection. He has blocked my phone number so my calls go straight to a message saying, "This number is not accepting calls from me," has blocked my email so any messages I try to send bounce back undeliverable, has made it clear through his lawyers that any attempt to contact him will result in a restraining order and potential criminal charges for harassment. His wife stopped calling me after that first conversation, probably scared that her husband would find out she had reached out, or maybe just unable to bear the guilt of knowing what kind of man she had married. I am completely cut off from my son and from the grandchildren I will never meet, erased from their lives as completely as if I had died years ago. Every night before I go to sleep on my mattress on the floor, I pray that somehow my son will remember the sacrifices I made, will remember the father who loved him enough to give up everything, will feel some small amount of guilt or regret for how he has treated me. I pray that maybe one day he will call or write or show up at my door to apologize and ask for forgiveness and try to rebuild some kind of relationship before I die. I know this prayer is foolish. Know that 20 years of silence and rejection followed by having me arrested makes it clear he wants nothing to do with me. But I can't stop hoping because hope is all I have left. I went to visit my rich son after 20 years, wearing my cleanest shirt and carrying sweets for grandchildren I had never met, and he looked at me with disgust and called the police and had me arrested for trespassing on his property. I spent 3 nights in jail for the crime of being the poor father who sacrificed everything to make him rich, destroyed my body and my future so he could have opportunities I never had. And he repaid that sacrifice by treating me like garbage that needed to be removed from his perfect life. Now I live alone in Texas in a one-room apartment surrounded by photos of the boy who used to love me, still waiting for a call that will never come, still hoping that somehow my son will remember he has a father who gave up everything for him and asked for nothing but love in return. I still wait for him even though I know he will never come. Still love him even though he is ashamed I exist. Still dream that one day he will remember the father who destroyed himself so his son could be free.